Gnocchi has to be one of Italy's more intriguing pastas because instead of the pasta being made out of flour, water, and egg like usual, it's often made out of potato. But before potatoes came to Italy from the New World, gnocchi was often made of cheese, as seen in this recipe from the 14th century. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we make medieval gnocchi, this time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from a 14th century treatise on cooking simply called Fragment of a Book on Cooking from the 14th century. It says, if you want gnocchi, take fresh cheese and pound it. Then take flour and mix it with egg yolk in the manner of migliacci. Put a pot filled with water on the fire, and when it boils, put the mixture on a board and spoon it off into the pot. And when they are cooked, place them on dishes and sprinkle on plenty of grated cheese. Pretty straightforward, though there is one word that the author uses that might need some explanation, and that is migliacci. He says that the ingredients should be mixed in the manner of migliacci, which turns out just to basically mash them all together. But to find that out, you have to go to an earlier recipe in the book for migliacci. And it turns out that in the 14th century, migliacci was a leavened flatbread made with cheese and flour that was then cooked in a skillet. And today, that same dish exists almost unchanged, mostly on the island of Corsica. And while I have no plans to visit Corsica anytime soon, I am going to be in Italy in March, in both Rome and Florence, so I'm going to at least look around and see if I can't find some migliacci. And I will know how to ask for it because I have been brushing up on my Italian with today's sponsor, Babbel. See, since I studied classical voice in college, I had to take quite a few lessons in Italian, so I knew what I would be singing about. But that was quite a while ago, and frankly I have forgotten a lot of it, so I wanted to brush up on it, just kind of have a refresher before I go to Italy, and it turns out that Babbel, which is one of the top language learning apps in the world, is perfect for that. Whether you want to learn a new language from scratch, or if you just want to brush up on something that you've studied previously, Babbel can link you up with the right lessons for you. If you're traveling, they even have lessons specifically for that can kind of focus on the place that you're going, including lessons about the food. So as I walk down the streets of Florence in a couple months, I'll be able to say, "Ho voglia di una bistecca alla fiorentina," because I hear the steak in Florence or Firenze is molto bene. I think Babbel is especially good for travel because in addition to learning the language, it really focuses on your pronunciation. So if you want to start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks, then just click the link in the description or scan this QR code and get 60% off of your Babbel subscription. And now, let us get back to our gnocchi, for which you will need 1 pound or 450 grams of fresh cheese. Now the recipe is not specific in what kind of fresh cheese to use. I'm going with a mild goat cheese, but you just want to make sure that it's something that you really like the flavor of because it's going to be like 80% of the flavor of this dish. Then 4 egg yolks, 3/4 of a cup or 90 grams of semolina flour, and some hard cheese like Parmesan or Pecorino. So the first thing to do is make sure your cheese is nice and soft. So if it is a firmer cheese, then go ahead and mash it until it's soft, and then add in the egg yolks and mash them all together to combine. If you have a large mortar and pestle, you can do it with that, but frankly it's just as easy, if a little messier, to do it with your hands. The egg yolks are also going to give this pasta a nice yellow color, as will the semolina flour, though if you just have white flour, that'll work as well. Once the egg yolks are all incorporated, add about half of the flour in and begin to mix it, and then continue to add more flour until the dough starts to come together. The thing is, you don't want to use any more flour than is needed, so depending on the moisture of the cheese, you may need a little bit more or a little less than the 3/4 cup. But you don't want to use any more than you need to, because if you do, then they'll become kind of gummy once they're cooked. So add just enough so that the dough can hold together well enough to be shaped into a few rolls about 1 inch thick. Then set a pot of water on the stove and bring it to a boil, and if you're not using a salty cheese, then add a bit of salt into the water as well. Once it's boiling, take a ladle and pour a little hot water on a board, and then set one of the rolls of dough on the board and start to cut off pieces, about the size of a walnut, and let them drop into the water. They should only need to boil for about 30 to 45 seconds before they start to float to the top, and once they do, you can remove them with a slotted spoon, and then repeat until you have gone through all the dough. Now you may notice that besides the main ingredient being cheese, the other major difference between these medieval gnocchi and the modern version is the shape. Most modern gnocchi have like grooves on them. There are actually boards made specifically to make those grooves. But in all of the medieval recipes, they don't mention grooves, and they're just said to be about the size of a walnut. The first time that the grooves appear, though, are in 1570, when Bartolomeo Scappi wrote a recipe that said take a piece of dough the size of a walnut and make the gnocchi, that is, macaroni, on the back of a cheese grater or on a table. Pretty much all pasta was called macaroni at the time, so don't let that confuse you. But this is the first time that we see some sort of groove being made, presumably as it kind of rolls around that cheese grater. But that is just one step in the rather long evolution of gnocchi. So before we start on the history of gnocchi, if you are into the history of pasta in general, then might I suggest an amazing book called The Discovery of Pasta by Luca Cesari. It is a deep dive into 10 iconic Italian pastas, including, of course, gnocchi. Now, the origin of gnocchi is really unclear, even when it just comes to the name. Some people think that it stems from the word for knuckle, which is nocca, and others claim that it comes from the word noce, meaning nut or walnut. It's not entirely clear. What is clear is that by the late medieval period, it's a known dish, and recipes begin to appear in a lot of writings, but they're all made with cheese. But this cheese version of gnocchi is actually still with us today in a version called gnocchi con la fioretta from the Veneto region, and those are typically made with ricotta. Also, this first recipe that I was able to find is from the 14th century, but it's likely actually from before that. So we don't know how far back gnocchi actually goes, because they just didn't write it down. An interesting note about the cookbook that it's from, it was actually originally given as a wedding gift. Not in the 14th century, but in the 19th century. In 1887, Olindo Guerini gathered some 14th century parchments kept in the library at the University of Bologna, and he decided that he was going to edit them and basically make them legible to the modern reader. And then he took that and gave it to his friend, who his daughter was getting married, so he gave it to his friend as a gift for his daughter's wedding. He opens the book with, "Dearest friend, since today you are marrying away your Laura, here are some pages from the 14th century, certainly unpublished and perhaps not useless to the history of the language and ancient uses." And while it might seem an odd wedding gift to us today, it was actually quite common for Italian scholars to do this back in the 19th century, and frankly, I think we should bring it back, because who needs a toaster when you could have a reconstructed medieval manuscript? Now, other than this recipe for gnocchi, there are several others in medieval documents. Sometimes they call them gnocchi and sometimes just macaroni, which, like I said, could basically mean any kind of pasta at the time. Which is why, when Bartolomeo Scappi, who was the chef to Pope Pius IV and Pius V, included the recipe in his great work, the Opera, he had to specify to make a dish of macaroni called gnocchi. Now this was in 1570, which when it came to cuisine in Italy was a time of change. Now, art and architecture were firmly in the Italian Renaissance by this period and had been for some time. But when it came to cuisine, it was still kind of had one foot in the medieval era and one foot in some New World ingredients and some newer techniques, so it kind of straddles the line. And one dish that really shows this evolution kind of happening is gnocchi. For Scappi, cheese was no longer the base. It was a much simpler canvas of flour, breadcrumbs, and egg yolks, or during Lent and fasting days, olive oil colored yellow with saffron. But on this rather plain pasta canvas, Scappi layers an array of interesting flavors. Besides adding some cheese on top, he also includes butter, cinnamon, and sugar. And butter, cinnamon, and sugar are kind of his signature flavor profile. He puts it on a lot of dishes, even if it's not what we would think of as a dessert, like gnocchi. Sugar and cinnamon weren't really associated with dessert or savory dishes at the time. It was just kind of spices. Another version he has does ditch the sugar, but keeps the cinnamon and also adds in pepper, walnuts, and garlic. Now these are some complex flavor profiles worthy of the papal palate, but not everyone was into it, even if they were wealthy, at least if they lived in the countryside. In 1653, a nobleman from Bologna wrote a treatise for city dwellers who have opted to live in a country villa. And in it, he talks about how people should eat. And perhaps it's just that the markets in the countryside weren't as well stocked, I don't know, but his gnocchi description, it's not really a recipe, is very, very simple. It's just a plain flour dough that is then boiled in milk and topped with a little cheese and a lot of butter. But simple though they may be, they must have been delicious, because he includes in the book, if you want some gnocchi left over in the evening, hide some of them, because I assure you, when you clear the plate from the table, it will be empty. But those that you've hidden for the evening can be reheated either in a pot or in a frying pan so that they form a crumbly and very tasty crust. But while these simple gnocchi might have done for those living in the countryside, in the city, people wanted a gnocchi with a bit more panache, and Antonio Latini was gonna give it to them. Latini was a household steward for a cardinal and then later the Spanish viceroy of Naples, and like Scapi before him, he found time in his busy schedule to write a cookbook, and this also featured new dishes, some of which have become iconic to Italian cuisine. His book includes the first Italian recipes for sorbetto, basically sorbet or ice cream in general, as well as tomato sauce, something that we can't really even think of Italian food not having today, though he does not use it as a sauce for pasta, but that's a whole other story. For our purposes, we want to talk about his gnocchi recipe, because it is truly a dessert version of gnocchi. It definitely gives a nod to Scapi's earlier version. Latini's dough is made with marzipan, cake, hard-boiled eggs, cinnamon, and sugar. And this wild gnocchi recipe totally opened the door for some crazy stuff, man, because only a century later, in 1773, Vincenzo Corrado released his cookbook Il Cuoco Galante, and in it were several recipes for gnocchi, which include ingredients such as truffles, prosciutto, pheasant, capon meat, spinach, and even calf brains. Definitely something you won't find on Olive Garden's tour of Italy. Now, Corrado, being a true artiste, played not only with flavors, but also with form. He would sometimes stuff the gnocchi with other things, or he would take the gnocchi, put them into a crust, and bake them like a pie. But even with all of these different flavors and techniques, there was one thing that was not part of his gnocchi recipes, and that's the potato. But potatoes had made it to Italy by this time. In the 1620s, there is an Italian description of the tuber, which says a potato is an herb which has large, tender, tuberous roots in great number, which are white, quite nourishing, both cooked and raw, and when cooked in hot ashes, they lose some of their tendency to cause flatulence. Not exactly a glowing reference, but at least potatoes were on the scene. The only thing is, nobody really wanted to eat them unless they absolutely had to. But then, in the 1760s, they absolutely had to. After a series of blistering summers and freezing winters, the grain harvest in Italy failed, as did most of the grain harvests around the Mediterranean, and this led to widespread famine. So, in 1773, a Bolognese agronomist suggested that landowners should in no way be dismayed, but should rather oblige their tenants to grow the aforesaid potatoes, because our region, though well cultivated, is insufficient to maintain the large population with our current produce. A few years back, I did a video where I made these French potato balls that were fried that were around during the French Revolution, and in it I talked about Antoine Parmentier, who around this time promoted potatoes in France for similar reasons. Essentially, outside of the British Isles, which had had potatoes going for a while, it was this period of 20 years where all of Europe seemed to get on the potato train and start eating potatoes. But in Italy, they were meant to replace the grain crop, so they were trying to use them to make bread and other things like that, and not pasta. It wasn't until 1798 when Vincenzo Corrado, the guy who had had all those crazy gnocchi recipes 25 years earlier, decided that potatoes could be used to make pasta. I mean, if you can make pasta out of calf brains, why not potatoes? Doesn't seem so crazy. So he wrote an entire treatise on the potato. And in it he includes the first recipe for potato gnocchi, which is made with potato, hard-boiled egg yolks, ricotta cheese, veal fat, and spices, and then they're boiled and topped with cheese and a sort of gravy. Not exactly the modern potato gnocchi, but we're at least on our way there. And over the next 50 years or so, chefs include more recipes for potato gnocchi in their cookbooks, often upping the amount of potato and reducing the amount of everything else. Until in 1863, a cookbook from Genoa includes several gnocchi recipes where the pasta is made up of only potato, flour, and nothing else. Each was served with a different sauce, but essentially the dough had become what most gnocchi are made of today. Now, even today, there are gnocchi made out of different things, like the cheese gnocchi from Veneto, and I've seen a lot of gnocchi made from different squashes and my favorite, pumpkin. But generally, the most popular form is made out of potato. And this is the type mentioned in Ada Boni's 1927 cookbook, delightfully titled Il Talismano della Felicità, or the Talisman of Happiness. Such a great name, because isn't that really what food is? The talisman of happiness. Anyway, she says that by this time, gnocchi had become the traditional Thursday dish of small Roman trattorias. And why gnocchis on Thursdays became a tradition, I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't find anything that really explained why, but it did become a tradition, and even today there is an Italian saying that says gnocchi on Thursdays, fish on Fridays, tripe on Saturdays. And I must admit, I am not a huge tripe fan, so for my Saturday meal when I'm in Italy, I'll probably opt for something else. But on Thursday night, when I'll be in Florence, I believe, you better believe I'm gonna search to find some gnocchi. Though, they probably won't be anything like the cheese gnocchi from medieval Italy. So once the gnocchi are all boiled, set them on a dish and top them with the freshly grated cheese. I opted for pecorino. And here we are, gnocchi from 14th century Italy. So forks were not a big thing in Italy at this time. They had shown up in the peninsula, but nobody was using them, which is why in the lasagna recipe from this period that I made some years back, it says that it should be served using a skewer. I'm not going to skewer these, but they're not too hot anymore, so I'm just going to use my fingers. So the texture is very, very different. I mean, it's essentially boiled cheese that's held together with a little flour and a little egg yolk, but cheese. It's cheese. I think having two different cheeses, like with very different flavor profiles, kind of is important just to give it some depth of flavor. But if you like cheese, they're good. The texture is definitely different than a modern gnocchi. They're a lot more crumbly. Again, maybe the type of cheese would change if you were using something like a mascarpone or something. I don't think that they had that at the time, but probably something similar. It might be a little bit different. They did have mozzarella at the time, so maybe you could use that. Though I don't think it was exactly the way that it is done today, but similar. But again, it is the flavor of cheese that you've got here, and the texture is just a little bit crumblier than a modern gnocchi. Now, I wouldn't want a whole bowl, but a few of these would be quite nice. So I'm still working on my itinerary for Italy. I'll be in Florence and Rome for about 4 days each. Not a ton of time, but enough time to kind of do some stuff. So if you have any suggestions on what I should see there, throw them my way, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.